Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. So, EgoGen, I'll get the brazen marketing pitch out of the way quickly. So, EgoGen's a renewable energy specialist, UK-based. It's been around and about for approaching, well, over 20 years. Been involved in some of the UK's earliest wind farm projects that are now coming up for 18, 19 years old and actually going through repowering. So the company has seen things through the entire life cycle and a lot of change in the UK market along the way. We're an owner and operator of wind farm projects. We have developed and operate wind farms actually in this area of the Cambridgeshire Fens. So have good, significant practical experience of how wind farm assets behave on networks that are becoming increasingly constrained. As Martin intimated, my personal background is in banking and finance, so I tend to keep quiet about that these days, particularly at dinner parties. But we have good, very clear understanding of the challenges of putting capital around these projects, and none more so in the financial environment over recent years. And significant practical experience of grid issues, as I said, having connected projects in the UK power network area. Brief slide about EgoGen, designed to demonstrate how we deal with everything through the entire start to finish. So the Boarding House Wind Farm project, probably should have titled this slide the developer's tale, a tale of woe and broken promises and delay and pain and suffering and money going down the drain. I'm sure many of you will have heard this many times before. It's a 5-turbine project. It's 5 kilometres southwest of March. We're actually sort of in the dead centre of this geographical trial zone. The project was originally submitted for planning to Fenland District Council in September 2009. For those of you who've been involved with wind farm projects, that means that there's usually about 3 years' work before that to collect bird surveys, ecological surveys, wind monitoring and the like. Unfortunately for us, by the time the council had got to grips with it, it went into planning committee in May 2010, bang on top of a general election. This is a deep conservative blue shire. So the inevitable result was that it got turned down at planning committee against the officer's recommendation for approval, basically on the grounds of, well, we've got too much of this round here already, haven't we? It's because it's a windy area and it's a good place to put wind farms, as the counter-argument. It was taken to appeal. During the duration of it being rejected and the appeal process kicking off, the Ministry of Defence got themselves organised and decided that the project was potentially interfering with one of their radars at RAF Cottesmore. RAF Cottesmore being a non-operational base without an operational radar, but don't let that concern you. So unfortunately, to give ourselves the best chance of success at the appeal, we engaged in negotiations with the Ministry of Defence, which led to the agreement that they would remove their objection in return for a radar mitigation solution, which is actually something that most developers in this part of the world have had to accommodate within their projects. There are no radar mitigation solutions that the MOD are currently trialled or endorsed. So that created a particular interesting conundrum. I mean, really the strategy was to wait and see how long it took the MOD to confess that this particular RAF station wasn't indeed running an operational radar. And that happened in August 2012, where the MOD finally relented. So against that, EgoGen is a classic smaller developer, cash constrained, shall we say. And therefore, just obviously physically and practically not realistic for us to accept any grid connection offer whilst such significant project uncertainty exists. We have maintained a dialogue with UK Power Networks regular connections team throughout to try and keep touch with what's going on. And obviously we were aware that the area was being increasingly saturated with not just wind but other forms of generation. The Ministry of Defence doesn't really have a problem with solar projects at the moment anyway, and neither have planning authorities. So, for example, a couple of quite large solar projects have come in and obviously taken up the capacity along the way. So, having got rid of the Ministry of Defence, we officially applied to UK Power Networks in September 2012 to be reminded that our connection offer was likely to be a little bit more than we were probably expecting. The business as usual offer, BAU offer, was issued in September, and we accepted this in December last year. The price of the business as usual connection, which involved effectively going up to the 132 kV connection point, was approaching 5 million, which for a 10 megawatt wind farm project we knew was unlikely to be economically viable. Although we were obviously aware that the flexible plug and play initiative was running in the background, so the acceptance of the business as usual offer was a mechanism to access the flexible plug and play process. So we've had our flexible plug and play offer for about a fortnight. We've had an ongoing dialogue with Adriana and Soteris at UK Power Networks really since September last year. So we've developed our understanding of what was likely to be in the flexible plug and play connection offer, and so we're now trying to get our heads around and come to terms with what the implications of the flexible plug and play variation offer includes, and it's very multi-dimensional. We obviously have to take account of what this means across all aspects of the project. So from the construction perspective, the technical implications. Are there any particular types of wind turbines, for example, that might behave on a constrained network better than others? How the turbine suppliers view the possibility that there is a third party that has a process to actually intervene in the operation of the generating equipment. Thinking about both the near-term and short-term operational requirements, are there extra things that we as an operational manager of a generator need to do? Is it as reactive as the process might suggest, or is there a higher degree of day-to-day involvement that's required on our part? What might the long-term effects of having a constrained plant be? Are there any operational risk issues that we need to be aware of? Turbines typically don't like being managed down or switched down, through grid faults and the like. So are we having to take account of those? So it's just a sort of very, it's a wide picture, and it's something that we're now working to understand fully. Importantly, to be able to explain this to financiers. Constraint immediately to me says less income, which obviously needs to be taken into account. And I think it's fair to say that, in this day and age, banks are not just conservative, but ultra-conservative. So we need to have a clear understanding ourselves of what the implications are. Particularly focusing on the due diligence. This is something that's, I would say, relatively new. And I think our biggest challenge is to avoid getting involved in the discussion loop with potential financiers of the project, which is akin to the question that used to be asked, which was, well, what happens if the wind doesn't blow? And the question we have here, I think the industry's moved past that. But the issue that we have here is, what level of constraint is likely to occur, and how that might affect the financing. We touched on in the Q&A session that as the discussions have taken place with UK Power Networks, it's been an interactive and an iterative process. So there's been the opportunity for parties like ourselves to give our comments on feedback on the various different mechanisms that have been under consideration. Adriana touched on the thought process within UK Power Networks, leading to the decision to move ahead with the capacity quota mechanism. I think you can see with each of the different alternatives that were suggested and were analysed, that there's no perfect mechanism. With any of these mechanisms, there are going to be some people who end up on the wrong side of the outcome, and some people who are satisfied with the results. It's a case, I think, of moving towards the one that provides the best fit for the circumstances at the time, and potentially encourages the greatest level of take-up in the near term to get the thing moving forward. So the big question on our mind at this stage is how we do suitable due diligence on the constraint modelling, and how much does that place a sort of a wider range of sensitivities on the economics of the project beyond just the general wind variation risks that any financier of a wind project is used to taking. We're just getting to grips with assessing the connection agreement documentation. It's largely based on obviously sort of standard format documentation anyway, but there is a new dimension to it. I can't really say too much more on that yet because I haven't yet brought myself around to sitting down for the required amount of time and sitting down with our lawyers to start picking through that. And of course, we've got 90 days from the date of issue to do that. So there is quite a tight timescale, and I think that if we can truncate that process, then so much the better. So the further challenges ahead, as I've alluded to, managing all of this through the usual contractual, technical, and financial due diligence process, but with an extra dimension. I think the fact that we've had the opportunity to have a good two-way dialogue with UK Power Networks for some time now means that we're not coming into this afresh. We've got an understanding of the way that UK Power Networks have arrived at this point. So therefore, what is the background to it? What are things that we can take back and question if we don't feel that the balance is right, and the routes to do that? I think that's been a welcome part of the overall process. Our challenge is obviously to identify how we translate this into a funding structure which doesn't unduly affect the value of the project. Banks are ultra conservative. It's likely that EgoGen will finance the project by bringing in a co-investor. How do we make sure that we protect the value that we've built in the project? Around the perceived uncertainty, and I use the word perceived specifically because I think the understanding exactly what is going to happen is not possible because these things involve shades of grey, and we need to make sure that people don't get themselves entrenched in an overly conservative approach. And my final bullet point, staying clear of government intervention in the renewables obligation. I think anybody that's involved in UK renewables, whether you're using the renewable obligation or feed-in tariff, is aware that the government has the renewables obligation has been under consultation since it came in over 10 years ago, so it's not a new phenomenon. But the date that's really seared on our minds more than anything is the 31st of March 2014, which is, in theory, the next date at which the government might reduce the level of ROC accreditation for onshore projects. So we have a project that if a group of elected planning officials at Fenland District Council had decided yes on that evening long ago, we would have been built by now. We would have been operating under the one ROC regime without any constraint. But that's life. That's the risks for a developer. Believe it or not, I'm not complaining about that. We are currently looking at a project that we hope we can build under the 0.9 ROC scenario with a manageable level of constraint that is accepted by our financiers. Just a few final comments. Adriana and Sotris had asked us to give some observations on the process, which I've mentioned a little earlier. I think it's fair to say that without the flexible plug-and-play initiative, we wouldn't have a project. 5 million grid connection cost. Our 5-6 years worth of work going through the planning would largely have been for no point, because we would have been stuck there. We'd have probably had to wait to see whether some level of reinforcement came in further down the line that provided us with a connection offer at 33 kV that was financially affordable. So we're actually quite pleased that UK Power Networks have taken this initiative forward, obviously. We're also quite pleased that they've chosen the March area to do it. And maybe the gods come back and start smiling on us a little bit further. As I've said, it has been a good dialogue. I think that UK Power Networks so far have thought and consulted about what works for the generator, and that's quite important. Clearly, this is not. We're hoping that this is not just an academic exercise. It can only work if people actually can connect up and use it to prove that the combination of things that are being brought together here can work. And I think that the team have thought quite carefully about what is the reality of life for smaller projects, because I think a lot of generation in the future will be privately owned or smaller developer distributed generation. That's one of the main the main dynamics in the industry at the moment, and therefore things that are overly complicated around future cost liabilities and collateralization for future cost liabilities will automatically prove to be a barrier to those smaller, independently owned or independently financed generators. I think the other observation that we'd make is that a lot of what we're seeing is not an effort to reinvent the wheel. So where there are tested solutions that are already in operation, for example, the smart grid solutions, part of the proposal has been deployed in Orkney. That helps because there is a reference point for us and our due diligence advisors to go and look at to see how the individual parts of this overall equation work together, and that's quite important. So whilst this is a new project for UK Power Networks, certain parts of it are already under test or are proven operational in situ, and that hopefully helps us to truncate our due diligence process and get on and accept this offer quite soon. Thank you.
Are there any? I'm just quite keen to kind of give a chance for any questions for Steve, and also kind of more broadly. I mean, we've picked on Steve as one representative of the developer community, but we've got a number of other of the developers involved in this process in the room. So, any questions that people wanted to pose to Steve or any of the other developers? Sure.
Just wondering what level of information you were given on the possible constraints that could come up the network. So sort of what level of information and what details have you provided, and how certain are you of that information?
Well, at this stage, we're just getting into the due diligence of it. I mean, until we'd had the connection offer issued, there was not much point spending time and money on something that might change. So the revised flexible plug and play variation was issued on the 1st of March. So we're just getting into that now. I think that the team at UK Power Networks has given us a good steer, over recent months, but obviously with the caveat that they themselves were still going through the process with their consultants. So, I mean, it was the big question for us: what level are we going to get constrained by, for how long, how often, and does that work? The level of constraint that's being proposed to us at this stage seems manageable. It does. The capacity quota mechanism is quite important, and within the connection offer pack that we've received is a fairly a quite detailed explanation from the consultants that have led on that smart grid solutions as to how they've modelled the constraint, what factors have been used. Against that as well, there's an overlay of UK Power Networks' assumption about the way that their local system works. So we obviously need to get into that, and we need to be able to make sure that we understand it and either try and replicate that ourselves. That might be possible, we don't know quite yet, or we need to be able to access the black box to make sure we understand it ourselves. It's the only way we're going to be able to convince our co-investors and our lenders. As I say, I think that what we've seen from UK Power Networks is that they recognise that whether you're using a bank lender or a co-investor, or whether you're financing it on balance sheet, if you're a developer that does the financial project the way, you've got to know what it is you're dealing with, and it's one of the significant risk factors that you would want to run sensitivities on. So we think at this stage that what we've seen suggests that there's a level of conservatism built into the figures, so that we're at least running our models and going into this and spending money with an expectation that we're likely to find out that the due diligence will say that yes, these are fair and reasonable assumptions, and that's a good basis in which to check that your economics work.
I think that may be something as well that Satiris returns to a bit later on. I think when Satiris come back, it's possible it will talk through exactly what that pack of documents has looked like in terms of when we talk about the DFPP connection offer. So, a couple of questions at the
back. Simon Brook from Electricity Northwest. Could you just give us a bit of detail on any changes that you're going to make to your installations to be able to manage a curtailment signal when it comes through? Are you going to do anything different than you would normally have done for a standard connection?
I think probably the answer is no. because our understanding of the way that the active management system works should mean that, for example, our choice of turbine is unlikely to be significantly different. One thing that we do need to take into account is not configuring the project purely on the basis of what is right for the constraint managed scenario, because this is a 20-year life project. There is the possibility that if UK Power Networks do the system reinforcements that might see the issue that provides the constraint lifted, that within a window of time the constraint might not be there. So our starting point is to configure the project as we would have configured it without a constraint, and then to look at whether the project running under the constraint scenarios still is a viable project. So there's no, from our initial observations, and we're still doing technical due diligence on this, we don't think it's a significant factor in our choice of equipment. We don't think we need a substantially larger substation building or anything like that. And the actual physical connection itself is back to what the original 33 kV connection spec would have been, which is for us is a relatively short run from the site to the 33 kV point of connection. So the actual physical characteristics of the project are not that different because of this this solution.
Radhart George, Evolution Energy. Just wondering if you have looked into any possibilities of insuring against being constrained more than the agreed amount or the sort of proposed amount. That's sort of the first part. And the second part of the question is whether you've managed to get any sort of indicative figures of how the flexible approach will impact your IRR.
The answer to your first question is we did at an early stage talk to our insurance broker to see whether this sort of thing would be insurable. I don't know if you've ever sort of looked at packages that have been on the market for a while, so just actually insuring just general wind risk. It's an extremely thin market because it's a fairly new concept. I think the short answer is there isn't insurance out there, and even if there was, it would unlikely to be cost effective for a single, a small project. If I understand the second part of your question, the impact on the IRR of the level of constraint, well, it obviously is. Obviously is going to be a level of constraint, and therefore the rate of returns on the project will be lower than in an unconstrained situation. We're also currently assessing, what additional covenants and terms and conditions a lending bank might put on the project. Do we need to hold additional cash reserves, for example, to bridge cash flow in times where the constraint might be applied? I think that sort of really boils down to getting a properly clear explanation of how this is likely to manifest itself in practice, and avoiding over conservatism in the in the financial structure. So I think the other point to make is that I mentioned the risk of what the government does with the ROC regime. There is currently for us a risk that if we can't build the project with certainty by 31st of March next year, we really have to wait until we know what the government wants to do with the ROC post 31st of March 2014. And the government, I think, has just closed its call for evidence on the current cost for onshore wind. So that probably implies that it'll take a good 3 to 4 months before they've proposed anything for consultation as to what if any changes to the ROC bands are required post 31st of March. So we run the risk that we find ourselves in this kind of hiatus period where you can't commit because you don't know what the scenario, what the ROC band is likely to be after 2014. And I think, as we've all seen, the government's decisions on what it does on ROC bandings, to a greater or lesser extent, is not totally driven by the cost of the technology, but more around political horse trading between DEC and Treasury, and that's just something that everybody in the industry has kind of got used to. So, you know, we have to factor that into our decision making as well. So that's an extra limb that I guess if we were pushing quite hard to finance the project now, an investor or a lender, you know, would be pricing into its, you know, rate of return that it expects the risk that, you know, the 0.9 ROC accreditation, you know, might be at risk if construction and connection slips beyond 31st of March next year.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it's been a really useful session, a really useful set of questions. So thank you.
Thank you.